Hello. My name is Mary Dundon and I'm the Head of Journalism here at UL. We're really delighted to have one of the world's most respected and experienced foreign correspondents, Fergal Keane, here with us this evening. He's giving a public lecture on one of the main challenges facing the fast-changing multimedia world. Today, we are all bombarded with information from a plethora of multimedia sources, and the challenge we face is to discern the truth from the propaganda and spin that we all get every day on Facebook, on the internet. Here in UL, we believe that this is a matter of major public interest for our students and also for the general public. And we're looking forward to Fergal's views on this challenge. There'll also be a chance for all of you afterwards to ask questions. So now I'd like to call on the Dean of the Faculty of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences, Professor Tom Lodge, to introduce Fergal. Thank you.
The title of Fergal's lecture tonight is The Struggle for Reason, and Fergal will be focusing on the battle for reason in a world overwhelmed by propaganda, in which there's an increasing preoccupation in the media with celebrity over the past 30 years, and an escalating trivialization of public debate. In many ways, this public lecture at Limerick this evening is a homecoming for Fergal, because he started his journalistic career in the Limerick Leader 35 years ago in 1979. And last year, when the paper celebrated its 125th anniversary, he paid a special tribute to the newspaper in a special article he wrote for it. He wrote, "The Limerick Leader taught me how to be a reporter, and I learnt the primacy of fact over opinion, that you serve the community best when you hold up a mirror showing both its good and the bad, and when you don't back off from the truth when threatened with power." And even at an early stage in his career, he showed his mettle as a reporter. He was one of the first people to report on racism in Limerick, reporting on the experiences of several African students at the University of Limerick, who were at that time amongst the very first African residents in the city who were refused entry to a nightclub. Following his job in Limerick, Fergal worked for the Irish Press, RTE, and the BBC in Northern Ireland, and then South Africa, and many other African countries as well, and then Asia. He was named as an overall winner of the Amnesty International Press Awards in 1993, and won an Amnesty Television Prize in 1994 for his investigation of the Rwandan genocide. In 1996, another award was an OBE from Queen Elizabeth II for his services to journalism. And he's won various other prizes, and I'm not going to embarrass him by listing them all. Though he is the only journalist to have won both the Royal Television Society Journalist of the Year Award and the Sony Radio Reporter of the World of the Year in the same year, 1994. In 2005, Fergal helped to found the UK-based Third World Development Agency, MSADA, which assists survivors of the Rwandan genocide. And in fact, it was only last weekend, on Sunday, that he was being quoted in the Sunday newspapers on his experiences in Rwanda 20 years ago. One of his most successful recent projects, which many of you will probably have seen, was the 5-part series, The Story of Ireland, a documentary co-produced by the BBC and RTE. He's been awarded honorary degrees in various places, including Staffordshire, the University of Liverpool and Bournemouth, and he's the author of several books, most recently A Road of Bones, The Siege of Koima in 1944, an historical account of a key battle during the closing phases of the Second World War in India. His memoir, All of Those People, includes references to his time at Limerick. Anyway, we're very honoured to have him here with us tonight for what I know will be a very challenging and interesting lecture. Please give him a warm welcome.
I have one. No, it's still here. Thank you very much, Professor Lodge. Thank you, Mary. If I'd heard an introduction like that about someone and I was sitting in the audience, I'd say, I bet your man thinks he's great. I don't. The one lesson of 35 years, as you unkindly pointed out, in journalism is the lesson of your own fallibility. And looking back on a journalistic career, which has been incredibly enriching, but has also had its fair share of mistakes. And I think you've got to reach an age like this as a journalist where you add some humility into the mix, along with all those plaudits and awards. You've got to look as well, a little like the Roman emperors being driven around with the slave whispering in their ear, "You are not God, you are not God." Too many people in the media think they are. W.B. Yeats famously said that the Irishman needs to keep about him an abiding store of misery to see him through any temporary periods of joy. And I have often found it not difficult to keep about me an abiding store of misery, given the kind of places that I have gone to. But it has never made me a pessimist about the human condition or people in general. I remain an optimist about humanity. I have deep affection for Limerick. You won't find many Cork people saying that, but I do. It was the place that gave me my start as a journalist. About a year after I arrived in Limerick, I was appointed rugby correspondent of the Limerick Leader. And what better preparation as a Cork man, what better preparation for being a war correspondent in later life. Because that fella knew nothing about rugby. I've covered over the last 3 and plus decades wars in every continent, in many, many countries. I've seen the very worst of what humanity can do, and I've also been privileged to see the best. I'm still surprised by life. I still get a huge thrill from going out to do my job. I really do. I love doing what I do. There are times when it exhausts me, but I never feel anything less than privileged when I go out to tell people stories. Now, I've seen massive media change over the last 30 years. I started out, I can remember the exact date, it was September the 17th, 1979. There are a couple of people from the Limerick Leader who are in the audience. I see Jimmy Wolfe, who was our West Limerick correspondent at the time and who took me out on my first marking, as we used to call them, on the day that I arrived in Limerick, got me blind drunk and sent me back in a state of alcoholic poisoning from which I thought I would never recover. But I arrived into a newspaper world where that still happened. There was immense fun, but probably too much drink. It was a world of typewriters. I walked in, I'll never forget walking into that newsroom in the Leader. It was a small little room. And walking in, and there was a cloud of cigar smoke. There was the smell of snuff. The rattling, hammering away at typewriters. It was an environment in which having a desk, a phone and a typewriter was not seen as a right, it was a privilege to which a cub reporter aspired. And it taught me many, many things, local newspaper journalism. The first thing was, and I go on and on about this, is the primacy of fact. I was sent out to cover things that might seem mundane now looking back from the high point of a couple of decades in international journalism, but going to cover the Limerick Harbour Commissioners, going every Friday to report on District Justice de Burka and his pronouncements at Limerick District Court. And it was, all human life was there. And of course, the crime wave that was going to hit Limerick City, the gang warfare, if any of us had been prescient enough, would have seen it coming from the daily reports that were coming out of that court. But I was taught that when you reported on a local newspaper, you really had to get it right, because you walked out the door and you met the people you were reporting on. It's a crucial bond that exists between somebody who is reporting locally and their audience, in a way that doesn't if you're working for the BBC, if you're working for RTE in Dublin, if you're working for a national newspaper. Very rarely will you bump into the people later whom you've written stories about or broadcast about. In Limerick, I walked out the door. I'll give you a classic example of it, and it's not to my credit. I decided it would be a great idea, a circulation booster for the Limerick Chronicle, if I ran a Bonnie Baby competition. And I can see some former leader staff laughing at the memory, because they will remember this vividly. This isn't a made-up story. I decided it'd be a great circulation booster, and the editor went along with me and said, fantastic. Put out an appeal in the paper for Limerick mothers to send in their pictures of their babies. And they duly arrived. Pictures by the hundreds. Some children gorgeous, others less so. But they were all gorgeous to their mothers. That's the important point of the story. They were all gorgeous to their mothers. And eventually, after some rigged competition, we decided who the winning baby was, and we gave the prize. I can't even remember what it was. It probably wasn't cash, because even in those days the leader was well strapped. But anyway. And then came the time for the photos to go back to the mothers. Now, they had most of them sent in photographs which had been taken at great expense by Limerick professional photographers. Could I find the photographs? I couldn't. So there was an army of mothers on my case. Worse still, the woman who sold newspapers outside the front of the leader was one of the mothers. And I think for about 6 months, I found myself ducking out the back through the printing works to avoid this poor woman. It was a salutary lesson, and I had many more where people would come up to me on a more serious level if I got something wrong and pointed out to me. I do remember I was fortunate to work under a very tough, a very demanding editor, Brendan Halligan, one of the best journalists I've ever come across. And I was sent to a county council meeting, and I had a great quote from a county councillor about the closing of a road, but unfortunately I put it into the mouth of his deadliest opponent on the other political side, and he rang up naturally furious. And the editor called me into the office, Brendan Halligan, and he said, and now there may be some fruity language in tonight's lecture, all right, so you'll have to live with it. It's part of journalism, and it's certainly part of Limerick journalism. And he called me into his office and he said, Keane, if you ever do that again, I'll fucking throw you out the window. And I looked out the window, and there was O'Connell Street below, and I looked into his eyes, and I knew he meant it. He would have, and anyone who knows the man knew he meant it. Anyway, that was an example of the kind of environment I worked in. So facts were sacrosanct. Clear English was sacrosanct. I remember my copy being sent back to me week after week for the first month or so, with that red biro right through it. I picked up a few from reading newspapers, I picked up a few tabloid cliches. So I came back one night from I can't remember what it was, maybe it was a Harbour Commissioners meeting, and I wrote, the chairman of the Harbour Commissioners lashed the City Council. And he called me and he said, lashed? He said, slaves are lashed. He said, nobody else. So that was the end of that. I've never used the word since. But a strong editor like that isn't just about keeping you on track. It's about knowing there's somebody who will back you if push comes to shove and you take on a difficult, controversial story. And I always knew Halligan would back me. There was one particular story, Tom Lodge referred to it, and that concerned the banning of black students from a nightclub in the city. And the story came to me literally as they do to the junior reporter in most offices. Somebody rang up to the editorial department and said, look, there are some students downstairs from NIHE, as it was then, and they were complaining about something. Will you go down and talk to them? Now, students from NIHE were complaining about things every day of the week, and I just said, this is more of it, they're giving out about fees or something like that. So I went downstairs, and there were 4 Nigerians there. And one of them I remember well. His name was Gabi Oke Opara, and he came from what used to be known as Biafra, which would be familiar to an older generation of Irish people. And this was a very clear-spoken, intelligent, sensitive man. I could tell straight away. And he described how the students had gone to the nightclub, the Savoy nightclub, and had been refused and told that blacks weren't allowed in. So I kind of found it hard to believe. It's 1979 in Limerick. Is that really happening? So I went and I told Halligan, the editor, and he said, okay, there's one way to find out. Go down with the photographer, get him to stick the camera under your coat, queue up, and see what happens. And so we did. We went down on a Friday night, queued up behind the students, and sure enough, that's what happened. They were turned away. We had the photographic evidence, and we had the quotes. So I went back to Brendan and told him, and he said, "Are you absolutely sure?" I said, "I heard it with my own ears." And he said, "Okay, now you've got to go to the Savoy, and you've got to sit down with them and put the evidence to them and see what they have to say, because their viewpoint is important." So we did. And then after that, my memory is of a great deal of pressure, of feeling a great deal of pressure for that story to go away. But Halligan stuck it out. Now, at the time, it could have had serious consequences for advertising in the newspaper. It was quite a story to stick on your front page as the lead, but Halligan went and did it. And not, there were people within the Leader, not in the newsroom, but people I remember walking back through the printing works and having a guy come up to me and abuse me for putting this out. It wasn't a universally popular thing to do, to put a story like that out in 1979 in Limerick. But Halligan printed it, and he stuck by me when the inevitable storm erupted after the paper. RTE saw it, they came down and interviewed me, and I suddenly found myself in that position I found myself in many times since, saying, "Oh my God, what have I put out there?" And hoping to God I was absolutely right. Because part of you will always question, no matter how sure your sources are. There was always part of a journalist which is saying, "God, supposing I got this out of context, supposing I missed something." But publish and be damned. We published and we weren't damned. It ended up with the Minister for Foreign Affairs was Michael O'Kennedy at the time, the Nigerian ambassador, both visiting Limerick and having a meeting with it, a meeting together about it. In fact, Planxty, the band, were due to play a gig here at what was then NAHE, and they were due to play a gig at the Savoy, and cancelled and came and played here instead. And I was there. And the Nigerians whom the story was about were very, very grateful. They were grateful that a newspaper in Ireland, a local newspaper in Ireland, had spoken up for them. And it taught me that lesson about you can have the best story in the world, but if the people above you aren't willing to back you, it's a really lonely place. I've come across it many times since. About 10 years ago, I made a documentary for the BBC, an hour-long investigation into the massacre at Sabra and Shatila, which pointed the finger at the then Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon and examined in depth his responsibility for what had happened there. And it went by the challenging name of the provocative name of the accused. And the pressure that came on once it was known that this documentary was going out, and I'd been to everywhere. I went to Lebanon, I went to Israel to interview Israeli soldiers who'd been there. There was huge pressure. And pressure came directly on the Director General of the BBC, who was Greg Dyke at the time. And I will always remember being grateful to Greg Dyke for saying to those who put pressure on him, "I have editors who edit programs. If you have a problem, you take it up with them." He preserved that line of responsibility, that at the end of the day, the editor's role must be sacrosanct. And I was lucky in that case to have an editor of Panorama, a guy called Mike Robinson, who had nerves of steel. He was one of the toughest people I've ever met. He really was. And like Brendan Halligan years before him, like the great newspapermen I worked with on the Irish Press in Dublin, who were my editors there, they cared about one thing, and that was that I got it right. I remember Halligan saying to me after that story about the Savoy, he said, "Look, by all means go after people who you think may have done something wrong. Do it," he said, "but be sure you get it right." What's the consequence of not getting it right? You undermine your own credibility. You undermine the credibility of the newspaper or broadcaster you work for. You undermine the particular cause story that you are reporting on. And in the wake of that documentary about Sabra and Shatila, the pressure, there were full-page ads taken out in American newspapers condemning us. You saw the degree to which it had affected the Israeli government. Now, I didn't see my role in that as going after the Israelis or going after Ariel Sharon. My role in that was about correcting history about telling a story that needed to be told. And I'll come back to this point later. Whether I was reporting in South Africa, Rwanda, in the Middle East, my job is not to be a cheerleader for any political cause or any grouping. It is not to be an enemy of any particular group or particular cause. It's something really simple that I learned here in Limerick. It's about trying to establish the facts, wherever they lead me. I'm often asked about political pressure. I didn't really experience much of it in Limerick, or if it was of a very direct kind, where people would come up to you and harangue you after a city council or a county council meeting. It was a great city for haranguers, this. Fantastic. No better men or women to harangue you. But I certainly did when I moved to Dublin and I worked in the Irish press. And that was a fascinating period, because Irish politics was in a state of real change at the time. The age of majority government, where you would have an absolute Fianna Fáil government in power, that was gone. And so now people were trying to cobble together alliances, coalitions, to create government. It brought with it a much more interesting political scene, but also a lot of political instability. So I worked on the Irish press under the editorship of Tim Pat Coogan. Again, in a very, very different way, because he was a much more detached kind of editor. But he was a man of courage. I didn't agree with every political position he took, but I didn't need to. I knew he had courage. I also knew, like Halligan, like Greg Dyke in the BBC, this was a man who would back me. And so my experience of political pressure in the press, well, there was one very direct experience that I had with Charlie Haughey. And that was, I was dispatched on Haughey's election tour. Now, Charlie Haughey was a strange kind of individual. On many levels malevolent, but on other levels incredibly charming and very, very funny. And because in private conversation, he dropped all of the kind of pious guff that you normally get for politicians. I think he depended on a kind of conspiracy of silence with journalists, so he would say the most outrageous things about people. And on one particular trip, we were going down the country. It was an election campaign. I was in the car with Haughey, and there were two candidates, and I won't name who they were, and the cars stop outside this village. PJ Mara, his press secretary, comes running back and says, the window goes down, and he says, yes, PJ, what is it? I said, Taoiseach, the candidates wonder if you'd like to ride into town in the car with them. And he looked at me and says, no, I would not. I'm going to have to be looking at them in the dial for the next few years. Why would I want to do that? Utterly contemptuous. And there was something about that you had to admire in a kind of perverse way. And I agreed with it. They were two characters you'd run a mile from. Then walking down the street of this village, I was there with my microphone. I was working for RT Radio at the time. And I was, if there are any people who are studying radio and how to be a radio reporter here, you will know, get your microphone in close, because nothing is more frustrating for an audience, particularly at my age when you get hard of hearing than struggling to hear what's on the microphone. Anyway, I'm there and I've got the mic in Charlie's face, and we're halfway down. Again, this is some fruity language, but I'm quoting a Taoiseach, so you have to give me a pass. We're walking down the street, and I've got the microphone up to him, and then he just suddenly stops in front of the candidates, in front of everybody. Says, if you don't take that microphone away, I'll shove it down your fucking throat. And this is, again, he depends on the conspiracy of silence of other journalists who won't report this. That was Ireland at the time. If you had that nowadays, can you picture it, Enda Kenny, turning? A bit of a stretch, but could you picture that now? So it was, and in that environment, this was the time when there were the O'Malley's heave against Charlie Haughey. It was an incredibly febrile atmosphere, and people were threatened, journalists' phones were tapped. Everybody felt the pressure, and felt the pressure that something, as the period went on, that something wasn't right in the moral health of the Republic. It took another 20 years to find out exactly what wasn't right in the moral health of the Republic, and that has been the subject of many inquiries. Perhaps not enough self-examination on the part of Irish journalism, of all of us who were journalists at the time. It didn't just come from Haughey, of course. This was an age when spin doctoring, something which is now taken for granted, which every journalist has to learn to deal with, was just in its infancy. On the Fine Gael side, you had a very, very effective series of press handlers. A man called Peter Prendergast, I remember, for example. And I did a long interview with Garrett Fitzgerald during an election campaign, during which I really hauled him over the coals. It was on the This Week programme for RTE Radio. Now, to Garrett's credit, he wouldn't do what Haughey did during an interview like that. Haughey would actually sit back and growl at you. And you would hear, if you go back and listen to the tapes, you'd hear this. I mean, he wanted to lean across and rip your throat out, but couldn't. Garrett wouldn't. He would go off in circles and try and lose you in labyrinthine economic arguments. And with me, that was pretty easy. Maths were never my strong point, but I would keep coming back to some basic points. But what do you say to the person in such a place? And at the end of it, having given him a very tough time, the red light went off. He said, "Oh, I quite enjoyed that," in that Garrett-y kind of way. But I got outside, and Peter Prendergast was furious. And he said to me, "Do you know," he said, "that my mother will be furious at the way you carried out that interview. She will be horrified that you were so rude to Garrett Fitzgerald." God bless his mother. How he could have known, but there was an interesting form of very Irish pressure, I thought, that. Bring the mother into it and make you feel guilty. There was another one. Some colleagues in RTE went by the maxim of, if somebody rang up to complain, you might get an irate member of the public ringing late at night to complain about something and pick up the phone. Again, there's fruity language involved, and you pick up the phone and they'd rave. "Okay, yeah, right. Do you know who I am?" Answer, "No." "Well then, fuck off." Many times I was tempted, but never did. I always thought somebody might recognise my accent. I certainly wouldn't do it in the BBC. I'd be found out. I think, as I said earlier, it is really important that we correct inaccuracy the moment that it's pointed out. But I think what we've seen progressively happen over the decades, you've seen it in this country, you've certainly seen it in Britain, is a battle for control of public thought in which journalists, if we're not careful, become pawns. It's bad enough being pawns, but becoming willing pawns, becoming sucked into a journalistic political establishment is a great danger. We need mavericks, we need outsiders. It's one of the great things that's happened with the growth of websites, independent political websites. And even websites which take a particular political view, is that they challenge the establishment journalistic consensus. That's hugely valuable. One of the lessons, I think, for the BBC is, you will all of you remember the Hutton affair, or the Hutton inquiry, and the BBC's problem over Alistair Campbell, Tony Blair, and the weapons of mass destruction. What the BBC did there initially was a perfectly admirable journalistic instinct, editorial instinct, and that was defend your people. But I think the problem becomes, once you learn that everything isn't as it seems and all your ducks aren't in a row, at that point you've got to stop defending. And you've got to acknowledge when you're wrong, admit it. Because what happens when you tend to dig yourself into a situation as a journalist, and I really impress this on people who are training to be journalists or just about to go into the profession, is that once you start to dig in, it becomes harder and harder as the pressure grows on you to get out of it and say I was wrong, without massive consequences. Most people, and I think the public at large, will accept when you get something wrong if you come along and admit it pretty quickly. And you say, look, this was a genuine journalistic error. It wasn't the consequence of malice or spite. But what you had at that time was an incredibly antagonistic relationship. And that became progressively more antagonistic as the debate went on, and had terrible consequences for people who were good friends of mine in the BBC. So always, always, if you can and you feel, maybe I was wrong here, say it. In terms of dealing with political pressure, there really is only one answer to those who telephone the programme to complain. And I'm not talking about complaint here on a matter of substantive fact. I'm talking about people who will either ring before or after a broadcast to accuse you of bias, but without ever really specifying in a forensic way what that bias entails, and who try to create a generalized atmosphere of pressure by constant phone calling, by constant tweeting, by constant emailing, by having lobby groups focus their attention on you. It is very, very easy, particularly for a younger journalist, to become intimidated by that kind of attention. Nobody likes it. Nobody likes people going public and saying you're biased. There's a whole army of websites out there aimed at the BBC, accusing us of bias in one different direction or another. Now, no human being is free of bias. No institution from time to time is free of bias. We're human. I always like to quote Kant, out of the crooked timber of humanity, nothing straight was ever made. And boy, that's true of journalism. You know, we are human. We're prone to error and prone to bias. But the idea that there's a kind of institutionalized bias, that directions are handed down from above, which we slavishly follow in relation to political parties, it simply isn't the case. I wish it was that simple. My life would be a lot easier if I had a set of instructions about how to behave. What there is for us is increasing pressure, much of it driven by newspapers who hate what we stand for, who don't believe in the idea of a licence fee. I'm sure RTE experiences similar pressure here, who don't really believe in the idea of public service broadcasting, and who will see in everything we do a liberal leftist plot. Now, there are others who see us as right-wing lickspittles, establishment hacks. And you know what? There are probably people who are establishment hacks. There are probably people who are right-wing lickspittles. There are probably people who are liberal special pleaders and bleeding hearts. Of course there are. It's a broad church. But institutionally, no. And one of the great things that has happened with the explosion of social media is that we are held to account now. And I'm not talking about, you know, political spin doctors getting on and haranguing us. I'm talking about people like you. I'm talking about people in Africa, in Asia, in the Middle East, who never had a voice before. You know, I went into foreign reporting at a time when the white man in his blue shirt and chinos got on a plane with a sheaf of press clippings about a remote African country, went there, wrote or broadcast what he liked about it, came back in the sure knowledge that nobody in that country would have the faintest idea what he'd said about them. So there was no blowback. There was no holding to account by audiences in the way that you would get on a domestic story. It did encourage some to what I might best describe as an extraordinary liberalism with fact and opinion in the way that they analysed countries. And it created a very Western-centric view of the world. And that's changed. It has been remarkable for me to watch the growth of independent media in Africa particularly, the way in which Africans in villages, towns and cities will now look at what I do on BBC News Online and then come straight back at me, either to say, you've got that wrong, you're biased, whatever, or to say, thank you very much for telling our story. Here's some more information you might need. The number of tip-offs that I get and contacts that I get as a result of social media is phenomenal. People coming who are trying to deepen my understanding of their societies. It really is, it is wonderful it's actually quite shocking when you think how long people had to put up with a version of Africa and the Middle East and Asia, which was entirely mediated by Western media interests. For how long that went on, how their stories were taken and left entirely to the trust and judgment of foreigners. Could you imagine if we'd had to live with that? And it is little wonder that, particularly in Africa, our view of the conflicts of modern African history were so lacking in understanding, because we didn't hear their voices. Look at the number of aid agencies who, until recent years, only used white people, white Europeans, as their spokespersons. So you have white reporters telling the stories to white audiences, white aid agency workers telling the stories to white audiences. Where were the subjects in all of this? They were seen all too often as just that, subjects, not real living people with opinions and thoughts of their own. And thank God that has changed. It hasn't just changed their own societies, which I suppose is the most important thing that this democratization of information has done, but it's changed us. You know, it just isn't, you can't any longer go and get away with the kind of glib nonsense that so many reporters did about Africa. Just before coming in here, I noticed there was a piece on Media Guardian about CBS News in America being attacked by Africans because they had done 2 segments on 60 Minutes, that huge, historic current affairs show, which were entirely focused on wildlife in Africa, and in which black Africans were merely a background. But here we have today their story being taken up by media outlets, these people who are complaining, media outlets all over the world, CBS being held to account in a way that just was unimaginable before. Now, there's a flip side to this, and that is the power of internet trolls, of those lobbies that I mentioned earlier, because they're incredibly adept at using and manipulating social media. So I go to Ukraine. I go to the front line on Donetsk, and I go to a little village called Pesky. And I do a piece on both sides of the front line. It's a very long, circuitous, precarious route, but I do a piece on both sides, in which I reflect both sides of the argument. And I don't do, what I absolutely don't do, and abhor, is the journalism of on the one hand, on the other hand. That's not what we're about, is giving equal weight to competing conspiracy theories or narratives. It is about trying to sift the facts and tell you, as best I know, some kind of vision or version of the truth of the situation. Often incompletely, I acknowledge, but as best I can. But that isn't good enough for the armies of trolls, which both sides have. And we now have evidence that the Kremlin is paying people in a building in St. Petersburg to keep hammering us every time we broadcast something. So I'll put my piece out. It'll go out on the BBC 10 o'clock news, and at the same time it goes out on BBC World News. And I guarantee you within seconds, I'll be bombarded by tweets. People will find out my tweet handle and they go for me. And it is, you're either Putin's running dog or you're a plaything of the fascists in Kiev. All in the same, but I keep wondering, my God, I am dexterous. I really am. I'm multi-talented to be able to do represent all these biases in one piece. But it's a real example of how people of this kind of people coming at something. Now, some of them are paid and doing it very cynical, but others do really believe this stuff. And so no matter what, we get it with the Middle East all the time, no matter how rigorous you try to be in the way you present the narrative, you will still see you will have people who watch it and say, you're biased, you hate Israel, you're an enemy of the Jewish state, or you guys, you just pay no attention to Palestinians and what they suffer. In saying that, I'm not for a second, I go back to what I said earlier about failure and bias being part of the natural state of humanity. Of course it exists, and there are times when we get it wrong. But the people who bombard us with tweets, who organise lobbies against us, are not really interested. In fact, they're definitely not interested in a unvarnished narrative of truth. No. What they're interested in is you becoming part of their narrative, in the story that you report, confirming their bias. And as young journalists, I would appeal to you, when you go into this profession, the first thing you do is you challenge your own bias. You challenge the way you see the world. I often think it's the only valuable piece of advice I can give anybody, is if you think you know the Middle East situation, if you think that the Israelis are a shower of whatever and everybody else was victims, or the other way around. Leave all that at the door, okay? That's not your job as a journalist. Leave that to people who want to carry placards and want to carry flags. That's not what you're about. Tom, you remember when we were in South Africa during the transition from apartheid? Okay, I was living there. I saw apartheid during the 1980s. I saw it again living there during the 1990s. It would have been the easiest thing in the world on a human level to become a cheerleader for the African National Congress, for the ANC and Mandela. But that wasn't my job. That's for activists. It's not for reporters. It's not my job to play God. I love that. There's a great line from Graham Greene's The Quiet American, where the Quiet American, who's this very idealistic character, anti-communist crusader, and he says to the drink-addled hack in the story, he says to him, what about God? Do you believe in God? In other words, don't you have a higher purpose? And the hack replies, he said, I'm a reporter. God is for the leader writers. And I love it. Not because of the literal sense of what it means, but what he's really trying to say is, it's Yeats's foul rag and bone shop of the heart. Get down there, get the facts. And other people can make what they will of the facts that you present. And simply by reporting the facts, it's enough. You don't have to carry a flag. We're all under massive pressure as journalists because of the advent of social media. I see it myself. I go on a story. It's not just about now producing a filmed report for the 10 o'clock news that night. It's about writing a piece for online. It's about tweeting constantly. You get calls from the news desk saying, Channel 4 are tweeting that they're at such a place and there's heavy shelling going on. Good for them. So it's increasingly my attitude. And I realise that at my stage in my career, it is easier for me to be robust, let me put it that way, with a news desk than it is for somebody who's younger. But I was saying, you've got Twitter, you've got Facebook, you've got News Online, you've got a rolling news channel, which is constantly looking for updates. And the danger there that you will slip, that you will put something out because of the pressure of demand or because you're simply exhausted. I mean, the demands on your stamina these days, particularly if you're working in a war zone, are phenomenal. I was in Tunis last week for the attack. I flew through the night, no sleep, change planes in Cairo airport, get onto another plane, land in Tunis, go straight to the scene of the attack. You're working all day, all night, frantically trying to find out what really did happen. You've people claiming this, people claiming that, people demanding tweets from you. And at one point of the day I said, right, enough. I'm not tweeting anymore today. Right, I'm not tweeting a thing until I can establish some clear narrative of what happened that I can stand over when I broadcast it to the world. And you've got to be, I see you all taking notes furiously in the front. For heaven's sake, let nobody ever pressure you into making a mistake that could destroy your career or wreck the lives of others. Because that pressure exists now in our business in a way that it never did before. It's massive pressure of time, of information. And we're facing, as I talked about earlier, not just governments that want to put a certain spin, political organizations who want to put a certain spin, but very, very sophisticated groups like Islamic State with their videos, with their tweeting. We're facing hoaxers who will put out videos. The number of times where you get a conflict situation and videos put out or photographs are put out which purport to be evidence, photographic evidence of that situation. And then when you check it out, they turned out to have been from something that was 2 or 3 years ago. The BBC has a full-time verification unit that spends its days going through material that comes in, trying to check its veracity. Because, people are just, no sooner do you establish a means of verifying information than the hoaxers are one step ahead of you. Everybody's involved in this massive information war. Everybody. From government to the smallest guerrilla group. People are wised up. I remember getting the shock of my life going into an African village. It was in Liberia somewhere, and watching this warlord on his satellite telephone doing an interview with BBC World Service in London. This was about 20 years ago. I think, my God, these guys are switched on. They know exactly when the main bulletins are on. They know our deadlines, probably better than we know our deadlines ourselves, and know when to get in with their information. They will ring up from the field. They'll ring directly into London to give an interview. And so all of that, it can create this perfect storm around you. Covering Charlie Hebdo, the Charlie Hebdo situation in Paris. Again, we had the dilemma of extraordinary live television footage being broadcast to the world of an ongoing security operation, and having to make calls ourselves on the news desk saying, well, hang on, if the world is seeing how the police are approaching this building and climbing and preparing to attack it, surely the guys inside can see it. You know, if they have access to a smartphone, all they need to do is have a look on Twitter and see what's happening. All kinds of challenges of responsibility are coming up. One of the reasons hoaxes are so successful is because very often they confirm what people want to believe. So a classic case in point was a young woman starts blogging from Damascus under the title of Gay Girl in Damascus. Her name is Amina. And she talks about being gay in Damascus, about campaigning for human rights, about the oppression of the state. And this is eagerly taken up by major news organizations around the world. She gets a girlfriend online with whom she engages in a long-distance relationship. And everybody believes this heroic story of this young woman until it all falls apart. And it turns out that the young woman is an American academic based in Scotland. Why did this take off? Because people wanted to believe it. Look at the video that went out there. I spoke about hoaxes a minute ago. One of the most striking in recent times was the video that went out of a little boy trying to save his sister under sniper fire in Syria. Did anyone here see that? Yeah. I mean, extraordinarily emotive stuff. And when you look at it I looked at it first and I said, that's interesting, but to me it didn't ring true. If you've ever been under sniper fire, it didn't, I just say, like a useless sniper. That was my immediate response to it. Callous, but something didn't ring true about it. Sure enough, it turns out it was made by a Norwegian, with funding from, I think, the Arts Council of Norway. It was made by a Norwegian television producer, who then came out with that line I've heard so many times. We were trying to articulate a greater truth. Bullshit. Whenever you hear anyone talking about that, bullshit. Okay? It's about the facts that you can verify. And you've got to be militant about that. But as I say, it's about, the problem for us is with all these sources of information, the great danger is that we will only ever now go to places which confirm our view of the world. So if you're left-wing, you'll read a left-wing website. If you're right-wing, you'll read a right-wing website. If you're pro-Israeli, you'll read a pro-Israeli website, and on and on and on. And you can see where that leads us. It leads us into intellectual ghettos, dangerous places to be, that can only deepen misunderstanding and alienation in the world. As I said a few moments ago, challenge always your own biases. Your most sacred beliefs, take them out, put them on the table, take them asunder. Then they're worth something if you've really convinced yourself. I have a basic policy when it comes to pressure and to abuse, particularly abuse. There's a thing on your smartphone, right, on Twitter, called the block button. And the pleasure that I take from using that, it really is one of the great joys of my adult life, is using the block button. So for complete morons, I use the block button, right, people who just abuse me. And then people who are just bores. Because the other thing about Twitter, of course, is it's not just abuse of cretins. The number of bores who want to inflict on you their analysis of the world. You don't have time. Life is too short. Life really is too short, and there's too much intelligent stuff to be read out there. So for them, the mute button. I love it, isn't it? You're mute. Shut up now, you. You're gone. But I would just say the challenges that I faced as a journalist 35 years ago in Limerick, I face the same challenges now, on a different scale, with a great deal more pressure. But it does come down to one very basic thing, and that is the willingness of an individual journalist to say, wherever these facts take me, I'm willing to go. Whoever it offends, whatever it does to my career, I'm willing to follow these facts. And sometimes you won't always live up to that. Sometimes you will be afraid, sometimes you will back off. But keep coming back, keep fighting. Thank you very much.